Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, on a ridge so remote that mapmakers barely bothered to name it, there lived a group of people that nobody could explain. They had dark skin, but sharp European features. They had straight black hair, but eyes the color of glass. They spoke English like everyone else in Tennessee, went to church like everyone else in Tennessee, farmed the same land as everyone else in Tennessee. And yet, for over 200 years, their neighbors looked at them and asked the same unsettling question, "What are you?" Nobody had an answer. Not the settlers who found them already living on Newman's Ridge when the first surveys were drawn, not the census takers who didn't know which box to check, not even the people themselves, many of whom told wildly different stories about where they came from, depending on who was asking and how much danger the honest answer might put them in. They were called Melungeons, and for 2 centuries, that word carried the weight of an insult, a threat, and a mystery all at once. Here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. In 1943, a government official in Virginia sat down and wrote a letter. Not a rumor, not a campfire story. An actual official signed government letter sent to registrars across the state, warning them by name about families who were, in his words, trying to pass as white or as Indian. He listed their surnames: Collins, Gibson, Goins, Mullins, Bunch, Freeman. He ordered clerks to go back through birth records and change what was written on the paper. A person could be born, live their entire life believing they were one thing, and then have a bureaucrat 2 counties away decide, on paper, that they were something else entirely. That single decision could cost a family their land, their marriage license, their children's legitimacy, even their right to be buried in a certain cemetery. This wasn't ancient history. This was happening in living memory, and it's the reason the Melungeon mystery isn't just an academic curiosity. For the families living it, guessing wrong about your own ancestry could ruin your life. So where did they actually come from? For 200 years, that question spawned some of the wildest, most romantic, and most persistent theories in American folklore. And I want to walk you through every one of them, because the story of how people tried to explain the Melungeons is almost as fascinating as the answer science eventually gave us. The first theory, and maybe the most cinematic one, claims the Melungeons were the lost descendants of Portuguese sailors, shipwrecked or marooned along the American coast centuries before English colonization ever began. Families themselves sometimes told this story to census takers and journalists, insisting they were Portuguese, not black, not Indian, just foreign and forgotten. It's a compelling image: stranded mariners walking inland, disappearing into the mountains, founding a hidden bloodline nobody remembered. But historians could never find a shipwreck, a colony, or a single verifiable record to back it up. Then there's the Lost Colony theory, tying the Melungeons to the vanished settlers of Roanoke, the English colonists who disappeared without a trace in the 1580s, leaving behind only the word Croatan carved into a post. This theory has real emotional pull because it connects to one of America's oldest unsolved mysteries, and it's tangled up with groups like the Lumbee, who have also been associated with Roanoke's lost settlers. It's a beautiful story. It's also never been proven. Next came the theory that Melungeons were descended from ancient Phoenicians, or the lost tribes of Israel, a claim rooted more in Victorian-era fascination with biblical mysteries than in any actual evidence. Around the same era, other writers insisted the Melungeons carried Romani blood, or were the descendants of Turkish settlers who had somehow crossed an ocean and vanished into Appalachian hollows centuries before anyone was keeping records of such a thing. One later researcher even pointed to supposed physical markers, like a bump at the back of the skull, sometimes nicknamed an Anatolian bump, or a genetic fever more common in Mediterranean populations, as if a shape of bone or a disease could prove a bloodline. Modern genetic researchers have since pointed out that neither of those traits is unique to any single population on Earth. You could find them anywhere. And then there's the myth families told most often about themselves, that they were part Cherokee, descended from native royalty, intermarried nobility from a proud vanished tribe. Local folklore even gave this a name: a supposed Melungeon king from the Revolutionary War era, said to have married into the Cherokee Nation. It's a story with no surviving documentation. But you have to understand why a family might tell it. In the world these people lived in, claiming Indian ancestry was often safer and sometimes legally advantageous compared to any hint of African ancestry. Saying we're part Cherokee could be the difference between being left alone and being reclassified, sterilized, or torn apart by the state. That's the thread running under every single one of these myths. They weren't just origin stories, they were survival strategies. Before we get into what the DNA actually revealed, hit that subscribe button right now, because we're about to walk through the actual scientific investigation into this mystery, and it is stranger, messier, and more human than any of the legends. To understand why this mystery took so long to solve, you have to understand colonial Virginia in the 1600s. In the earliest days of the Virginia colony, before slavery had hardened into the rigid, generational institution it would become, the line between black and white servitude was blurry in ways most people today don't realize. Some of the very first Africans brought to Virginia weren't enslaved for life. Men like John Groweir, recorded in the Virginia court records of the 1640s, managed to purchase freedom for their children through hog-raising arrangements with their masters. Free black men and free white women lived, worked, and in some documented cases, married each other in these early decades before the laws caught up and slammed the door shut. And then the door did slam shut. As the 17th century wore on, colonial lawmakers grew alarmed at the number of free people of mixed ancestry, and they began passing increasingly harsh laws to stop it. Interracial marriage was criminalized. The legal status of a child began to follow the mother rather than the father, which meant that any child born to an enslaved woman was enslaved for life, no matter who the father was. Free families of mixed heritage found themselves squeezed from every direction, and many made a choice that would define their descendants for the next 300 years. They moved west into the mountains, away from courthouses and tax rolls and the prying eyes of neighbors who might report them. Generation after generation, they pushed further into the Blue Ridge, into the Cumberland Gap, into the deep hollows of what would become Tennessee, always intermarrying within the same small cluster of families, because the law gave them almost no other option. By the time white settlers reached Newman's Ridge in significant numbers, they found a community already established there, self-contained, close-knit, and impossible to categorize using the racial vocabulary of the time. Now, here's where the actual scientific detective story begins. In the year 2000, a British biologist named Kevin Jones, working with researchers at the University of Virginia's College at Wise and University College London, ran the first real genetic survey of a self-identified Melungeon population, sampling people connected to that same Newman's Ridge community in Hancock County, Tennessee. His initial results looked almost anticlimactic on the surface. On average, the sample came back roughly 90% European, with small percentages of Native American and African ancestry, numbers that weren't wildly different from the general population of the surrounding region. But buried inside that European percentage was something odd. There was more diversity than expected, hints of ancestry pulling toward the Mediterranean and areas outside the typical Northern European pattern that had settled Appalachia. It was intriguing. It was also far from conclusive, and it left the door wide open for both skeptics and true believers to keep arguing. The real breakthrough came over a decade later, and it came from an unusual source. Not outside academics parachuting in to study a curiosity, but the Melungeon descendants themselves. Starting around 2005, a partnership formed between Melungeon community researchers and a genetic testing laboratory, aimed at finally getting a rigorous answer using Y chromosome DNA, which traces a direct, unbroken paternal line, father to father to father, all the way back through history. 4 researchers in particular, Roberta Estes, Jack Goins, Penny Ferguson, and Janet Crane, spent years building what became known as the Melungeon DNA Project. They didn't just test anyone who claimed Melungeon heritage. They cross-referenced DNA results against actual historical records, focusing specifically on documented core families from Hawkins and Hancock counties in Tennessee, and the southern edge of Lee County, Virginia, the heartland of the original Melungeon settlements. In 2012, they published their findings in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy in a paper called Melungeons, a multi-ethnic population. And the results cut through 200 years of myth like a blade. The core Melungeon paternal lines traced back overwhelmingly to 2 groups: sub-Saharan African men and white women of Northern or Central European origin. Not Portuguese sailors, not Turkish settlers, not lost tribes of Israel, not, in almost every documented case, Native American ancestors at all, despite that being the single most commonly repeated family story for generations. Among the specific families tested, only one lineage, the Sizemore family, showed a documented Native American genetic connection. Everyone else who had grown up believing in a Cherokee grandmother or a vanished Indian ancestor found their actual paternal DNA pointing somewhere else entirely. Sit with that for a second, because it reframes the entire Melungeon story. This wasn't a population that fell from the sky, or wandered in from across an ocean, or descended from ancient royalty in a hidden bloodline. It was something both more ordinary and more remarkable. It was what happened when free African men and European women fell in love, or simply lived together in the earliest and most fluid years of colonial Virginia, before the law made that kind of life illegal. Their descendants didn't vanish. They adapted. They moved. They survived centuries of suspicion, exclusion, and outright persecution. And they built entire communities that endured against odds that were, quite literally, written into law to prevent them from existing. Before we go further into how this discovery landed with the Melungeon community itself, and why some people are still furious about it, go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, because this next part is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, and I don't think you'll want to miss it. Here's something a lot of documentaries about this topic leave out. The DNA results were not universally welcomed. When the 2012 study made national news, plenty of Melungeon descendants were thrilled to finally have a real answer, after generations of guessing. But others reacted with real anger and disbelief. Some genealogists and community members pushed back hard, arguing the sample sizes were too small, or that the core families selected for study didn't represent everyone who'd ever been called Melungeon across 200 years and dozens of scattered communities. And that criticism isn't entirely unfair. Remember, the word Melungeon wasn't a tightly defined ethnic label to begin with. Historically, it got slapped onto all kinds of different mixed heritage groups across the Appalachians and beyond, groups in Ohio and West Virginia, in the Carolinas, some related to the Newman's Ridge families, some probably not related at all. Researchers today generally agree the DNA study nailed down the ancestry of one well-documented cluster of core families with real historical paper trails. It did not, and could not, speak for every single person or family who has ever claimed or been assigned the Melungeon label, but there's a deeper reason some people resisted the findings, and it's worth sitting with honestly instead of glossing over. For generations, claiming Cherokee ancestry wasn't just a family legend passed down for fun. In a Jim Crow South governed by one-drop laws, it could be a matter of survival. If your family could successfully claim Native American heritage instead of African heritage, you might avoid forced sterilization, avoid having your marriage invalidated, avoid your children being barred from white schools. Generations of Melungeon families built their identities, quite literally, around the ancestry that kept them safest under a legal system designed to hunt down and punish African heritage specifically. So when DNA testing arrived and told some families that the safer story wasn't the true one, it didn't just contradict a grandmother's tale around the dinner table. For some people, it felt like history reaching back one more time to strip away an identity that had cost their ancestors everything to maintain. That tension between the emotional, protective family narrative and the cold clarity of a DNA report is honestly the most human part of this entire story. It's easy for us, from the outside, decades later, to say, just follow the science. It's much harder when the science is unraveling the exact story that once stood between your grandparents and a state-sanctioned sterilization order. What makes the Melungeon story matter beyond one mountain community in Tennessee is what it reveals about America's earliest years, a period most people never learn about in school, before slavery calcified into the brutal, rigid, multi-generational system that defined the 18th and 19th centuries. Colonial Virginia in the early to mid-1600s was a far messier, far more fluid place. Free black settlers, indentured servants of multiple backgrounds, and European colonists lived in closer proximity and with far more legal overlap than most people imagine. Historians studying what's now called the Atlantic Creole population have found that many of the earliest Africans in British America weren't uniformly enslaved for life, and that free families of mixed African and European heritage were genuinely part of the colonial landscape, right up until the laws changed to stamp that reality out. The Melungeons of Newman's Ridge are, in a very real sense, living proof of what that earlier, messier America actually looked like. Preserved for 3 centuries in the hollows of the Appalachian Mountains because moving into isolation was the only way their ancestors could keep their freedom and their families intact. Think about what that isolation actually required. Generation after generation. It meant choosing land nobody else wanted, steep ridges and thin soil that couldn't support large farms or plantations, precisely because that kind of land kept outsiders from settling too close. It meant marrying within a small, tightly bound circle of families for 2 centuries, not out of tradition, but because the law left almost no other legal option available to them. It meant watching census takers walk through their communities decade after decade, unsure which racial category to even write down, sometimes recording the same family as white in one census and mulatto in the next, entirely depending on which official happened to be holding the pen that year. Identity for these families was never a fixed, comfortable thing. It was a moving target, reshaped every 10 years by strangers with clipboards who had the legal power to decide who you were allowed to be. And their story isn't isolated. Once you start looking, you find echoes of it all across the eastern United States. The Lumbee of North Carolina, the Chestnut Ridge people of West Virginia, the Redbones of Louisiana and South Carolina, the Turks of South Carolina. Groups in Delaware sometimes called the Delaware Moors, scattered communities that historians now group under the umbrella term tri-racial isolates. Different names, different regions, different specific family trees, but the same underlying pattern. Free people of mixed African, European, and sometimes native heritage, pushed to the margins by law and prejudice, surviving by isolating themselves in places the dominant society didn't want and didn't bother to closely watch. Today, the word Melungeon has done something remarkable. A term that started as a slur, an accusation, a word one church member used against another in a Virginia church record from 1813, has been reclaimed. Descendants now use it proudly as an identity rather than an insult. Genealogists still argue over exact family lines. New DNA studies still get published and still generate controversy. But the broad outline of the story is no longer a mystery wrapped in Portuguese sailors and lost tribes. It's a story about two people, an African man and a European woman, making a life together in a place and time that had almost no space carved out for them to exist, and about the astonishing centuries-long resilience of the families they left behind. So the next time somebody tells you they've got Melungeon blood, or Cherokee blood, or some vague, half-remembered story about a mysterious ancestor nobody could quite explain, you'll know there's a real chance that story is hiding something even more remarkable than the legend itself. Not a shipwrecked sailor or a lost tribe, but two ordinary people who loved each other in a world that made that love illegal, and whose descendants refused for 300 years to disappear. If this kind of hidden American history is the kind of thing you want more of, make sure you're subscribed. Because there is so much more of it buried in these mountains than most people ever get taught, and I'm not done digging.